I am very happy to be here. I want to appreciate Dennis first and foremost for an excellent introduction, maybe more than he may have oversold me a hair, but I'm happy to be here. This is very much home for me, as it was, as he mentioned, for just under 4 years. Me and my buddy Jonathan, we arrived at the same time, and you guys became parents to us, and now brothers and sisters, and this is a place we hold very dear to our heart. Let me catch you up to where we are in our lives. So we came here. I met my wife at Virginia Tech. Best thing I ever did was marry her right after Follow Christ, but married her, and we moved to Johnson City, Tennessee, down the road. And she went to pharmacy school for 4 years at ETSU. When she graduated, she got a residency, and the way residency works is you put your name into a computer, and hospitals put their name into a computer. It spits out a name, and that's where you go. And it spit out Denver, Colorado. And so we packed up all of our stuff, June of 2020, arrived in the city of Denver. It's on lockdown. The church was not meeting, and we wondered what we had gotten ourselves into. Turns out to be a great move, however. We ultimately were able to hook up with the church at Bear Valley, and we were worshiping there for about a year, and they wanted a new minister. They said, we're looking for a new minister, but we're not looking for a traditional minister necessarily. We're looking for somebody that had these characteristics. At the time, I was in software consulting, and I was looking to do something other than software consulting. And quite literally, Shannon jabbed me in the ribs and went, "He's describing you." And so I applied for that job, and not too much longer, I got it. I became the new technology and involvement minister at Bear Valley. Well, as everything shook out, COVID turmoil and that kind of thing, it turns out that they were not going to have budget for a third minister. So here I was, a minister with now no minister experience, no minister degree, and no minister job. So we had to figure out what we were going to do. And fortunately, there's a school attached to Bear Valley. I've already taken a few classes, but I've been given a great opportunity. God has blessed us at every step of the way, and that opportunity is provided to me because of you all and your decision to support me. So for that, I am eternally grateful, and it also provides me an opportunity to come back and speak to you all and come home. I had a great week. I wasn't at VCC, but I was at High Rock, and if my voice makes it all the way through, that'll be good. If you have your Bibles this morning, go ahead and turn over to Exodus chapter 16. We're going to take a trip through a section of the Old Testament this morning. The title of our lesson is When the Manna Ceases. When the Manna Ceases. So in Exodus 16, we pick up when the manna showed up for the first time. The children of Israel have just completed their exodus from Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea, and now they're in the wilderness, and as they are wont to do, they start complaining. And the first thing they're going to complain about, why'd you bring us out here to die of starvation? And so God is going to give them manna. So let's pick up in verse 2. It says, "And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, and the people of Israel said to them, Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my ways, in my law, or not." So the people of Israel complain, and God says, don't worry, I'm going to sustain you, and I'm going to sustain you in a unique way. I'm going to rain bread from heaven. Let's skip on down a few verses in 14, pick up in 14. "And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." Now, in studying for this lesson, this almost reads like an Abbott and Costello routine, if you know a little bit of Hebrew. Manna in Hebrew means, what is it? It's a play on the Hebrew word for what is it. So, what's that thing on the ground? I don't know. What is it? Well, that's what they called it. They called it, what is it? So they received this bread from heaven. God has decided to sustain them. And let's read one more verse down in verse 35 this time. The people of Israel ate manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. God's original design for them for manna was not 40 years, but He's going to sustain them throughout all this time. And 40 years for them, they're going to eat this manna for 40 years. That brings them all the way to Joshua chapter 5, which is where we're going to go to next. By sheer volume of text, by page number, that's 130 pages in a 1,000-page Bible. That's 10% of the Bible is a time where the children of Israel had manna. It's going to go all the way through everything that transpires in the remainder of Exodus, all the things that transpire in Numbers, all the things in Deuteronomy and the first part of Joshua. Manna is going to become a thing that defines this Israelite people for an entire generation. This bread from heaven that God is going to give them. So let's go forward in time to Joshua chapter 5. Joshua is a book of transition. The children of Israel are going to cease their wandering. They have a new leader. And in Joshua chapter 5, we get where the manna is going to cease. And I want you to think of all the things that have happened to the Israelites in this time. So they received the manna, and then not long after that, they went to Sinai. And they had a conversation with God briefly, and then they said, no, we really want Moses to have a conversation with God, and we'll stay down here, and that's how that's going to work. But they had a conversation with God. They had the fiery pillar and the cloudy pillar that guided them. They had the spies that were sent into the land, and they had the great disappointment. We read about that in our Bible class hour this morning, where they decided that they were not strong enough to take the land, and their punishment is that they were going to wander in the wilderness. And the wandering was not uneventful. They had serpents, and they had pestilence, and they had many other things that killed them, and they had a dying off of a generation. This is absolutely wild for me to think about, but if you do the math, there's an entire generation of people, and there's only 2 people in the whole generation over the age of 60. Joshua and Caleb are the 2 exceptions, but can you imagine a generation? They have no elder leadership. They have nobody over the age of 60, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, and of course Joshua is going to become the leader here. But they also have a generation that has known nothing but manna. Now, some of them may be, some of the late teenagers that weren't part of the curse, maybe they remember vaguely the food of Israel. But for the most part, by and large, the people who are getting ready to enter the land know nothing, but I wake up and I go out in the morning and I pick up manna. So manna has become a sign of God's sustenance, a sign of God's provision. They know nothing else other than manna. But in Joshua chapter 5, we have an enormous period of transition. Moses is no longer going to be our leader. Joshua is going to be our leader. We're no longer going to be wanderers. We're going to be warriors. We're going into a land that God is going to give us. But before we do that, we've got to do a number of different things. The first thing we have to do is we have to cross that pesky Jordan River. Now, literally, we're just crossing a river, but metaphorically, we are crossing a boundary that God has set for us. We were not allowed to cross that river before this time, but this is going to be our transition period. God's transition periods are often through water. It was a transition out of Egypt that happened through water. Now we have a transition into the land of Canaan through water. We're going to cross that water, and we're going to enter a new phase in our relationship with God. And to do that, we have to renew our covenant. But because we were disobedient, the Israelites were disobedient in their time coming out of Egypt, they abandoned that covenant and God said, okay, now you've crossed the river, we got to take care of some things. The first thing we have to do is we have to take care of circumcision. Apparently they weren't practicing that in the wilderness, so we have to reestablish that. And the second thing we have to reestablish is the Passover. I would argue that God is reestablishing their identity as His covenant people. The two things that we immediately identify with the Jews are circumcision and Passover. And God says you have to get those straight before you enter the land. And this is the context that we get when we get to Joshua chapter 5. We're going to pick up and read in verse 8 of Joshua chapter 5. When the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And so the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, and in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. I want you to imagine now something that you have had for 40 years is going to be taken away. Something that it's the only thing you've ever known for most of you is going to be taken away. I wonder what it looked like the day after the Passover. I have to imagine that they got up and went out of their tents and they went out to collect the manna, and there's no manna there. I can't imagine what they were thinking. It had to have been something that is an absolute stark contrast. Because, again, for some of them, that's all they've known. That's all they've had to sustain them. And I can't help but think that it was unsettling for them to no longer have manna. Now, they were going to eat of the produce of the land, but I have to think that it was unsettling for them to not have manna. So what does this have to do with anything, really? Now that we've given some background, I want to give you 3 points of application about the day that the manna ceased. The first one is that we become satisfied with the substitute instead, we become satisfied with the substitute instead of what God has originally intended for us. I told you when we read at the beginning of Exodus that the children of Israel ate manna for 40 years. I think they wouldn't even had to eat it for 40 weeks. Their original intent was for the manna to sustain them from the time they got out of Egypt until the time they crossed the land, which in their time was just a matter of a few weeks or a few months maybe. But instead, because of their disobedience and because of the way that they felt about God, they ended up having to live with a substitute for 40 years. Instead of living off the plenty of the land, they had to eat that manna, and they became satisfied with that substitute. Now, there is a lesson about being satisfied, but when God brings them to the land, they now are going to get to enjoy the fruits of the land, which is going to be better than eating manna and quail every day in the wilderness. So when I think about this, when I think about how this applies to me, have I become satisfied with the substitute? Now, I've already told you my story at the very beginning, how I came to Bear Valley and how ultimately after 13 months, I used to joke, one day they're going to figure out that I'm in a great position. And I don't know how I got here and it's going to end. Well, it ended sooner than I thought it did. But it was only after 13, 14 months that they decided that they couldn't support me. And I fully support the elders of Bear Valley for making that decision. It was important for them to do that so that we can continue to have a congregation in Bear Valley. But on that day, for me, my manna ceased, right? And I had become very, very happy in the position that I was in. Now, I've been able to transition into a new position, and I have new manna, if you'll allow me that analogy. I'm going to get to go to Bear Valley for 2 years. I have no responsibility other than to study God's Word and to teach it to others. That's an incredible blessing in my life. You guys are affording me that life. But for the 2 years I'm at Bear Valley, that's going to be manna for me. But I need to know that God is going to take me somewhere else. After Bear Valley, the manna, the thing that is sustaining me, is going to cease, and I need to look forward to God's blessing. I need to make sure I do not become satisfied with the substitute. You may be in a transition period in your life today. It may be that you are between where you are right now and where God wants you to be. There's something that's sustaining you. And what we need to remember is that if God is bringing me somewhere, I need to not make sure that I'm not satisfied with the substitute. And that even applies to this body that I've been given right now. I've been told that this body is only temporary and that I'll be given a new body. I need to make sure that I'm not satisfied with the substitute of this body. And believe me, I like this body. But I need to make sure that I'm not satisfied with the substitute. The second point of application is I need to remember that God could be providentially preparing me for great things. I believe almost to a man the children of Israel are going to agree that the produce of the land flowing with milk and honey is going to be better than eating the same bread every day for 40 years. But it's still unsettling when we have change in our life. It's still unsettling when something that I know, a staple of my life, becomes upset. But we need to remember that God could be providentially bringing me to something better. I'm reminded of the words of Esther, or words of Mordecai, rather, to Esther in Esther 4 and 14. It says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have come or whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Mordecai was telling Esther, in a time of transition, in a time of change, in a time of hardship, it is very possible that God has providentially placed you in this position to prevent tragedy coming to the Jewish people. It's the same thing. The same thing could be said for the children of Israel. God providentially has taken you to this point, and He's going to take away your manna so that you can go exact judgment on the nations as God has directed you, and you will enjoy a rest and a fruit that is better than that of the manna. So we need to be reminded that in difficult times of change, it could be that God is providentially preparing us. He is taking away our manna and could be preparing us for something much greater. And even if it doesn't occur in this life, He has given us assurance and promise that ultimately we will be given a rest and a land flowing with milk and honey like Canaan. And that is metaphorically heaven for us. So we need to realize that God is providentially preparing us for something greater. So the first is we need to make sure we don't become satisfied with the substitute. Second, we need to make sure that, we need to realize God could be preparing us for great things. And the third point this morning is that we need to realize that every challenge is an opportunity from God. I want to read a quote from Paul House. He wrote a book on Old Testament theology, and he says, "God's provision now switches from the miraculous manna to the providence of living off the bounty of the promised land. They receive the fruit of the land as a prelude to receiving the cities of the land. God's people surely know now that they have experienced a new beginning, a fresh opportunity to be the Lord's holy nation." See, the generation before them had to eat manna for 40 years because of their disobedience. It was never God's design for them to eat manna for that long. This new nation now has an opportunity that the previous nation never had. The manna is going to cease, and they have an opportunity to enjoy God's bounty and enjoy God's blessing and to do the things that God called them to do. And we've already talked about the circumcision and the Passover to become God's holy nation. In our lives, we need to realize that every change in our life is an opportunity for God. You think about the first part of James, brothers, lead your mind to joy when you encounter various trials and temptations. We have an opportunity in every change in our lives, and some of our changes are hard. We could have the death of a family member or a spouse. We could have an illness or a diagnosis of ourselves. We could have the loss of a job. All of these things I would consider times where the manna has ceased. Something good in our lives that we relied on is getting ready to stop. But each of these opportunities is an opportunity that God has given us to do what He has outlined for us in His Word, and to be joyful about it, and to always look for opportunities to convert others to His Word. So this morning, the lesson we can learn about when the manna ceases is we need to make sure that we are not satisfied with the substitute, whether that's blessings in our life now or this physical body. We need to make sure that we remember that it could be that God's providence is preparing us for great things. And we need to remember that every change is an opportunity for God, an opportunity to do great things. Of course, all of these things are true because Israel are God's people. Now, we have an opportunity right now where we're going to talk about what it means to become God's people. It may be that you're here today and you don't know what that means. See, in that time, God's people were chosen. God said, the Israelites are going to be my chosen people, but post-cross, after Jesus came, he said that the people who are my people are the people who want to choose me. The people who want to take advantage of the free gift that I've given, the people that want to go down into the watery grave of baptism and be raised to walk in newness of life, those are the people that I'm going to consider my covenant with, and I will provide them a rest, much like I did the children of Israel. So if you haven't had an opportunity to do that, in just a second we're going to sing a song, and you'll have an opportunity, and we'd be happy to study with you and baptize you. But it also may be the case that you're here this morning. You've already decided, I want to be one of God's covenant people. But maybe God has stopped the manna in your life. Maybe you're experiencing one of those hardships we just talked about. The death of a spouse, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, hardship at home, hardship with children, whatever the case may be, and you've lost sight of the fact that God could be providentially preparing you for great things. If you've done that this morning, but you would like the prayers of the church to be restored, or as we just talked about, to be buried in the watery grave of baptism, whatever your need, come forward as we stand and sing.